around our circle of developer friends. We call him the database master. And true to the name, his talk is also about databases. So welcome, Frank Midigo. I'll let you say more about yourself, Frank.
Wow, thank you. That is a very tough name to give me. Yeah, so as Pauletta said, my name
Sorry
is Frank.
to Frank. Sorry. There was some noise coming from your end.
Okay.
Yeah.
How about now?
It's better. Yeah, there you go.
Okay. So yeah, been doing Elixir professionally since 2019. And so the funny thing about my story is I didn't really choose Elixir, but I would say Elixir chose me because I had no choice but to do Elixir because I was an intern at Podi and Podi was using Elixir. But since then, I fell in love. I've been helping to organize some events. And yeah, that is just me. So about the talk, I'll be talking about my journey with Ecto. It is kind of like my personal journal because there are some few tricks that I've learned along the way. These are just my personal ideas. Some I've borrowed from, I've just stolen them from somewhere because I saw that they can actually work with my ideologies. So just a quick overview. Uh, to those who don't know Ecto is a database library for Elixir. And if you've worked with Phoenix, you've probably interacted with it. Yep. So I have 4 items that I'll take you guys through. The first one would be why you should have base modules. And sorry, can you guys hear me?
Yes, we can. Proceed.
Okay. That's perfect. Right. So I have 4 items. The first one would be about organizing your schemas. The second should be about why you should define your custom types. And then the third will be about writing composable Ecto queries. And then I have a bonus. Right, so let's get started. Okay. Right, so when you're defining your schema, you'll probably have these 2 lines. The use Ecto.schema, and then you'll import your change set to track your changes. But then this is actually okay. But as your project grows, you realize that you'll now need to alias some files, some modules, I mean. You'll start importing queries, and then you'll have to, again, start adding some associations to your schema. And remember, you'll be doing this for your different schemas. Okay. So this is just an example. We've defined our user schema.
We now can't hear you. Yeah, so sorry everyone, Frank seems to be having some technical issues, so he's working on it so that he can get back to showing us tips and tricks in Ecto. I can see Frank seems to be back. Frank, can you test if your microphone
Yeah,
is okay? Awesome. I can hear you now.
right. Sorry about that. The internet just seems to cut out when I'm now having the call. Right. I don't know the last point that you guys had me. What was the last thing that I said?
Yeah, you are at the point of talking about how big this can grow when you do imports and aliases.
Oh, right, right. So we started with our simple 2 lines, right? But then this has grown now to 7 lines. And remember, we'll have to repeat this because now we can have our, let's say we have our user schema. The user can have multiple blog posts, right? And then the blog posts can have multiple comments. So this can get tiring over time. And personally, I don't know why it wasn't tiring at the time, because I did this repetitive work for close to 2 years. So sometimes I don't know why you can't really find out why your work is repetitive. So the best solution to this is to have one schema. So you can always create your app.schema, and then all this repetitive code, you can have them here, right? And then the other thing is you should also introduce your shared aliases, okay? If you realized here, we were aliasing our user schema, the comment schema, and then on this other side, we're also aliasing other schemas as well. But you can reduce this work just by having one module, right? And we also have one particular module for holding all our aliases, so that the next time that I want to define my schema, all I have to do is use my app.schema. And then this will now alias all my schemas that I need, and it will import for me all the items that I require, including the query, the change sets, and the schema itself. So one particular advantage of having your aliases and defining your schema in one place is that you can have application-wide configurations. Like if you notice in this case, I've defined my primary key to be of type binary ID. The default is always the big serial, which is actually the ID itself. But then you might want to use your UIDs, like in this case. So all I'll have to do is to configure the primary key and the foreign key type to be UID. And this will now apply to all the schemas that you have in your project. Right? There. Yes, and also one other item that you can always add is the timestamps options. So by default, Ecto uses naive datetimes, and the timestamp fields are always inserted at and updated at. But if you're migrating from, let's say, active record uses created at. So you might want to continue using the timestamp fields that you had in your legacy application. So Ecto has this particular option for you, which I think you might find handy. Yeah, I think that is all. That is all for the schema. So the next thing should be it's still about avoiding repetition, and it is about defining your own custom types. Right. So this is actually funny. It always comes about when you're defining your fields. Like for instance, one thing that always gets me is you have a phone number field, right? And then you have the user can have the phone number, and then probably the same user can have another recovery phone number. But then all these phone numbers have to be validated, probably using one single regex, or probably you have a particular format that these phone numbers should be in. That is the reason for this particular meme. right? So if you're always finding yourself using the same fields and you actually want to validate these particular fields in all your different schemas, you can always use Ecto.types. Okay, so like for this our use case, let's say we had a phone number, but then at your application or the front end level, you want to format this phone number. So the typical phone number in Kenya here, it will have the 3-digit country code, and then the area code is also a 3-digit, but it can also be a 2-digit code for landlines. And then you have the 6-digit identifier. You might want to format your phone number this way to the front end. But then remember, at the back end or at the database level, your phone numbers are not stored this way. You want to have one uniform format of storing your phone number. And at the same time, you don't want to limit your users to send you, or rather to key in the phone numbers in a particular way. They can either decide to add the country code, they can fail to add it, or they can just add the 7 digits. I mean, I don't know how many these are. So you can simplify your work instead of having to rewrite the same code in all your different schemas. You can define a type for your redundant field. So like in this case, we can define a type for a phone number. This type, we have to tell Ecto whenever we are casting how it's supposed to behave. So like in this case, when you're casting, if at all it's a binary, we know that the country code is a 3-digit code. The area code can be 2 or it can be 3. And then the suffix can be a 6-digit code. So we're actually defining a struct, even though at the database level, we are storing this as a string. Right. So the Ecto type has 3 particular callbacks. You have the type, the cast, load, and dump. Actually, those are 4. So the type should tell Ecto the real type, like the database types, that it should fall back to. And then whenever you are casting, let's say you want to compare in an Ecto query, you can always write your queries whenever you are saying, let's say from Q in query where Q.phone number equals, and then you have the pin operator, your phone number there. So Ecto will actually cast this particular value that you're giving it to, that you are comparing to the schema's phone number. And that is where the cast will come in, right? And then you also have to tell it what it needs to do when it's loading this particular data from the database. So we do know that when it's coming from the database, then it's a string and it's a valid string. So I've just decided to reuse the cast operation. Okay, and then we also have to tell it how it needs to handle this particular data when you're now inserting to the database. So when we are inserting, remember we defined our phone numbers as struct, having the country code, area code, and the suffix. So when we are dumping, we have to convert this to a string. And that is what I'm doing here. So the only thing we are validating is to make sure all the fields are actually valid. Like the country is a 3-digit code, the area can be 2 or 3, and then the suffix has to be 6. And that is all. So once we have this, we can now reuse this phone number everywhere or anywhere that we will want. So like in our case, we had our user schema. The user had a phone number. We just define it as a phone number. And then we let Ecto do the work for us, similar to the recovery phone number. Right. Yes. So if we pass it to the cast the cast function for the change set, as I mentioned earlier, it's going to come and call the cast over there. So what are some of the advantages of using, of having of defining your own custom types. If you've ever worked with customer sensitive information, so something like a phone number, you won't really want to have users see it, or actually even when you inspect it in your logs, you don't want to write the actual user's phone numbers in your logs. So Ecto has this particular field here, not field, but option. You can specify and tell it that whenever you're inspecting this schema, you should redact this field. So it will kind of put in the star. It will actually put in the redacted words when you're inspecting the phone number. But additionally, at your application level, you might also want to restrict, or rather, restrict it in such a way that everybody, or all front-end users, or anybody else interacting with the system should not see the phone number of a particular user. The only time that you might use the phone number is when you're actually sending the message. So you can utilize the protocols. Elixir has something called protocols. And the functions like toString, it actually uses, it implements the string.chars protocol. So you can implement this so that every time you actually render your phone number on your HTML templates, then it can appear redacted like this. So because at this point, you have the phone number, you have the area code, and you have all those particular digits. So at this given point, you can just decide to say, I want my phone number to be, we had the number.suffix. How can I do this? Okay, let's just leave it. But we can take the first 3 characters. So number.suffix. And then we probably take in the convert it to a list of characters, of the graphene, sorry. And then here we can take in probably the first 2 characters and the last 2 characters, right? And then all the other characters can be replaced with the X here. That way we'll have solved our problem once and for all. Right. And additionally, you can also implement your own, the inspect protocol, because the one implemented by Ecto only applies at the schema level. This only applies at the schema level. It means if somebody inspects this particular phone number, they'll be able to see. So you can say, is it always the inspect? I think it's here, it's the inspect. The inspect protocol. Let's see, how is it done? When right, so you have to implement the inspect function. So that is the only thing we have to do. To come in the inspect. Inspect text in the number in the options. So you can come here and say what you want is to have a string such as this, phone number. And actually you see this with your Ecto change sets whenever you inspect. Something like this. And then let's take some random values that you'll take in from the number. So this way you will have you will have protected the customer's information. You can also use this for credit cards. Right. The next item that I had was about, oh sorry, and by the way, if you have questions, feel free to pop them in. I think I don't mind answering them during the session. The next one was about writing your composable queries. So now that, if you look at the journey that we've taken, we now have our one schema file, we've reduced the boilerplate by now defining our own custom type. So the next thing is about reusing again. It's all about reusing our queries. And there is one thing that I'll say I have journeyed and I've seen different ways in which people are doing it. So when I began, that is when I began writing Elixir and using Ecto. I used to define all the queries in the context, right? And then one day, here in our certain podcast that you should have your queries in your schema because these are pure queries, are actually pure functions, right? A query will always be a query. And then we did try that, but then the schemas now started growing bigger and bigger. And then another idea came out. I think this was also just in another podcast about having having a different module specifically for queries. So something like, if we had our module, our schema, the schema will have a separate field. We have a separate module specifically for queries. But then one problem with this is you have certain queries that won't actually be shared all through the application. For example, you'll see queries such as this starting to pop up because, yeah, you decided that all queries should reside in one particular module. But then there are these queries that you'll actually never reuse them, kind of like the aggregate queries. You're actually aggregating data from the database. So this didn't really work. Then I decided to go back again to the context. So now the next thing that I did is, instead of having all queries in the context, why can't we just have the queries that you can actually share? They can be reused. Why don't we have them in the user schema? So we can have some queries here. Query an ID. And then in our context, we can use this particular query to probably even form this bigger query. And that is still the rule of thumb that I used up today. If at all that particular query cannot be reused, then there's no need for it to reside in the schema or even in your queries module if you decide to go with the queries way. I'm not saying there's a perfect way of doing it because up to now I still don't know the right way, but the way that works for me is having them in the context and in the schema, but only the reshared, the ones that can be shared are the ones that are residing in the schema, right? Which brings me to the next thing. So how do you even determine that these particular queries can be reused? And the simple answer to that was, for this particular query to be reused, then they need to match to exactly the field names. What do I mean by that? So suppose we have our schema, our user schema, it has the name, and then we've added some more associations, organization, posts, and comments. So if at all I want to define, well, let's say I want to get a user by ID, right? I can define such a query. This query can be reused regardless by which particular context, because it's matching to a particular field in this schema. I can define another one, I like name, because this can also be reused. Name is a field inside the user schema, right? And then we move to the next level. What if we have associations? I can decide to search for users using the post titles. Assuming these are users, these are like a blog post application. I can decide to search for users using the blog post titles. And how will I do that? So you now have to join into those associations, and then again use the I like, which is a Postgres function. This will translate to a Postgres function. I mean, yeah, I don't think I like is not in the standard SQL spec, so it only applies to Postgres. And you can do this for tags as well, and this can be reused over and over again. You can decide to join this to other queries when you're searching for your particular users. All right, so here is an example of how we can actually reuse this. In our user schema, let's say we are now just filtering the users, and then all we have to do is to provide our filter, right? So our filter can be something like this. So I try to filter users and say I want users using name. There's a string, right? And I can also decide to say I only want users who have created blog posts with the following tags. Right. I hope I didn't miss anything. Right. But then if you do this, this is still okay. This is still okay. If we add another filter for the posts, using just the post association, let's say also, in addition to the tags, I want users who have blog post, it has a title, Phoenix. So this is where a problem, like a slight problem might come in. If you realize, we have for each of the particular queries, for these two queries, I mean, we had to join to the post schema, right? So it means if I'm searching for both fields, I'll join twice to the post schema. And this is a problem that actually can be solved using named bindings. All right, we can use named bindings to solve this particular problem. For these queries that we had here, we didn't really name them. We used the positional binding for this particular case. And I have the different examples for the named bindings, the positional bindings, which Ecto actually provides. But in my experience, you should avoid using the positional bindings. An example here, we can join, or rather we can compose this particular query like this. If at all I wanted all the users with this an inner join with some posts, I can write another query and compose it on this first query. But then now, if I want to access this particular binding here, if I wanted to access this particular binding, I have to do it based on the position, because the first binding is U. The second join that I had is P. So I'm assuming, because we only had two bindings, so the first one was U, and then P will take the second one. Okay. If again I am supposed to compose using this same query, not the second query, but this time I wanted to access the comments association, I will again add the third binding. Notice that these are actually positions in the order in which they came in. This can be quite confusing, especially if you have a bigger query. So you should avoid using the positional bindings. Instead, you should use named bindings, which are explicit. So in this particular case, this is the same example. We have the same query. We have a user, and then we are joining it to the post schema. But this time we are naming this particular binding as post. So the next time that I want to join to this particular query, I have to use the name. I named it post, so I know that it is there. And if I'm now to join to this query too, and I wanted the comments, because I labeled it here as comments, I can actually access it here. And I don't really need this if I'm not using it. So this can still work. If at all I'm only looking for comments with an upvote count of 5, this is what I'll have, versus this one, which is a little bit confusing. Right, so back to our problem. Our problem is that we are joining twice to the same schema, right? In this particular case, if we had the post tags and we have the post title, so this will join twice. So we want to avoid that. Okay. So now we can name our bindings. I think we've already gone through that. And Ecto actually provides a way for you to check if at all a particular binding already exists. And it provides a helper function, which is called with named binding. So you can see we can check if from this particular query, do we have a binding named posts? If we don't, then join or rather create that particular binding. That is what this statement means. So that being the case, this I would call this the safe join option. So if it isn't there, we will join it. If it is there, we'll leave it as it is. But remember, we named it. So we are sure that if it is there, it will have a name called posts. So if I'm looking for posts with this particular title, all I have to do is now pattern match, or rather take that particular binding and use it to search for my particular post. And this also applies to the same one, to the other function, I mean, which is kind of repetitive as well. You can see this exact same code has been used here, which introduces an opportunity to refactor, but I didn't really do it. So we can have our function, safe join. Safe join post. Right, in the query. So now we can copy in this and just move it here. So now we have it there. Yeah, and we can do this. So now we can replace this here, making our queries as neat as possible. Good, and we'll have it here. Yes, and that is how you can use named bindings to avoid duplicating your, or rather joining to the same schema twice. You might ask why I didn't use dynamic, because Ecto actually also provides it provides this other function which you can use to join dynamically, or rather to query dynamically. The only limitation for this is with dynamic, we actually comparing against existing bindings. Like in this particular case, we must have our existing bindings. But if at all we use our normal reducer, where is our reducer? If at all we use our normal reducer, we are actually in control, because we are saying if at all this particular association doesn't exist, is when you should join it. But then for the dynamic, you have to provide all the bindings beforehand, which kind of makes me to lean towards this other direction. Right. On to the next one, which is the bonus. So in the bonus, I had a couple of things. The last one is actually the most interesting one, about multis. But then in the bonus, I just added some particular things, or rather some particular functions that I actually find very helpful. And or rather these are the actual tips that I was talking about in the talk title. So in your repo module, there's this function called query, which you can use to execute raw SQL functions, no, raw SQL statements, I mean. This actually, it doesn't really exist in the repo. It is in this, is it? Yeah, it is in the Ecto adapters. Right. Yes. So this particular function resides in the Ecto SQL library and not in the Ecto itself, the Ecto library. But then it has been added there. Behind the scenes, what it does is it calls this function and then it provides your repo as the first argument to this particular function. But I've found it helpful. You can use it to execute those particular statements that are not supported by Ecto, but you might need to execute them. The other one, I think most of you might know this, the preload order. In our user schema, the user had some posts. If at all I'm listing this particular post, let's say I'm on the user's page and I want to see this particular user's blog post, I can tell Ecto by default, when you're preloading this particular association, order them based on a particular criteria. And this actually accepts even the fragments. So you can add your Ecto query stuff here. You can say, based on the date published, ascending, descending, and then you say, probably created that. So you can add them as many as you can, as long as it is supported by a particular function order by here. Right. The other one is about using embedded schemas to validate your front-end data. If you notice in our function, our filter users function, we used atoms, but in real sense, when the data is coming in from the front-end side, it's usually string keys. So you can always use embedded schemas to define your filter. Okay. Once you have this, you can actually do the validations on that other side to make sure that the user is actually giving you the correct filters. So here, for this particular example, or rather for this particular function that we are using, it is expecting fields like name, post title, post tags, right? So if at all you are using live view, you can define your filter there and actually define a change set in there. Then this particular change set is what you can use in your live view to create your form, the filter form that is there, and do your validation. So when the user submits, the user will actually submit data that you have validated yourself. So the data that you're submitting to the context function is already sanitized data, and not just any kind of data that the user can submit. Right, which brings me to the last item. Using Ecto.multi or put a sock versus cast a sock. So the put a sock and cast a sock are convenience functions in the change set module that can help you to kind of deal with association data. Like for this particular case, if you had our user schema and this user had posts, of course, it's not really a real life scenario, but assuming you want to create your user with this user already has existing posts, blog posts, okay? And you defined your change set like this, and you are casting that particular association post. So the good thing with Ecto, if you give it data the way it expects, then that data will go in. So if you have this kind of data, the user had a name and then had like 2 particular posts, blog posts. If you are using cast association, Ecto will insert the post, which is actually not part of the user's table, but it's a different table. That is the convenience that the cast a sock and the put a sock functions give to you. But the only problem I have with these two is whenever you're now updating your data, okay? There's a particular option in when you're defining your associations that is called on replace. So the on replace option tells Ecto how it should handle a particular association if at all there is a replacement, right? Let's say in this case, the user already had like 10 blog posts, but then whenever you're now updating, because you are casting here, whenever you're now updating, you've only provided 2 particular blog posts. So what should happen to the 8 that were existing? By default, Ecto will raise. It will warn you to tell you that you are trying to do this, but then in your existing associations, you only have this. And that is the only problem I have. You can only set it to delete. You can set it to update, or you can set it to nullify the foreign keys on the particular post, which is still okay. My only problem is I have to go back again and read it, because it has caught me several times where I'm using put a sock and I find that data has been deleted. So nowadays, what I tend to do is to actually not use them at all. I'm not saying they're bad, but I feel that multi gives you that kind of control. So this particular statement here, how we are creating the user using the caster sock, we can do it using Ecto multi. You can see it's a lot more work, a lot more code, but probably some might agree. But when you go the multi way, you are actually the driver. You are in full control. You will control if you want some posts to be deleted or if you want some to remain. Your thoughts on that? But to me, I feel having full control is actually better than having Ecto do it for you, because it will do it for you, yes, but then if you're not careful, it might get you, and it might bite you at the wrong time. Yes, that is all I had, unless we had any questions from the side, Sigu.
Yeah, thank you so much. I tried signaling you that you're out of time, but yeah, yes, we ran out of time a few minutes ago. I don't know. Do you have time for questions, Paulette? And do you have any question?
Yes, we have questions.
All right.
They're just 2. So the first one is, how does the named binding work with the select statement?
The named binding. Okay. So I will have, let's go back here. So whenever you are writing your normal SQL, right, let me write this. I will say select u.star from users, join join posts. Oh man, it's been long since I wrote SQL. Join posts P on P dot user ID equals u dot ID. This will translate to something like this, right? So I have named my users table U, and I've named my posts table P. And then I can use these particular bindings to reference my fields. So that is in the SQL world. On the Ecto side, remember this particular query here. This particular query that we have has not yet been translated into this. So Ecto still needs a way to keep track of your bindings. And when you define it this way, it will use positions. When you say from U in user, U came in first, so it is the first binding. And then you join the next one, P. P is now the second binding. So it means if at all I was to reuse this particular query, if I wanted to compose a query on top of this one, the existing bindings, we already have the first one, which references the user, and the second one, which references the posts. If I add another one, that will be the third. And this is because we are not giving them names. So Ecto will use, let's say it's in a list, so the first come, first serve. Did I say it correctly? Yes. And this will build on continuously. Okay. But then when we go to the named binding, now think of a map. In this case, we're thinking of a list. Now in this time, think of a map. We had U. This one we didn't name. Can you name the first binding really? I don't think so. But the first binding we have is U. But then we are joining to the next one. But now this next one, we are naming it as posts, right? But now think of a map. So now we've named our second binding as post. For this particular one, we didn't really know. We don't know. We don't even know what this P is. For us to know, we have to come back to this first query and check which one was the second one. But for this particular one, we have named it. So we therefore know that if I find a key called post, then it references the binding that was joining to the post association.
Okay, thank you. The second question, Paulette, I think we have time for one more.
Yeah. The second question is, what's your opinion? I'm just reading as they've written it. What's your opinion when I say something like there can be confusion? For example, let's say user-related queries are in 3 different modules. That is the context, the schema, and the query. Can that get confusing according to you?
Yes and no. Yes and no. It depends, because I do put my queries in the context. But this particular queries, like I mentioned, there are these queries that I won't really use them anywhere else. If you saw this particular example, if you had a query called users having unread notifications with the data preloaded query. This is kind of a query that was doing some aggregates, or it is just doing a one-time thing. It is isolated on its own. So I don't even have to define it as a function. I can just define it in my particular context function, right? I just have to define it here, literally, and then use it to do my queries. So the only time that they'll get confusing is when you have these query functions in the module again, and you are trying to reuse them on other modules. Now that will get confusing. I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, I hope it did too to the person who asked. So yeah, those are all the questions. I'll pass the mic to Sigu.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Frank. I really appreciate the tips and tricks on Ecto. I have extra tricks on what to go and at least try out next week when I'm working on Ecto. Thank you. When you were starting, Paulette said that we always consider you as the master of the database. Thank you for confirming that statement.